The private dining room at the Élysée Palace was meticulously arranged for what President Emmanuel Macron considered would be a routine diplomatic meeting. Crystal glasses caught the afternoon light streaming through ornate windows, while portraits of French presidents gazed down from gilded frames. Everything about the setting was designed to remind visitors of France's historical power and cultural sophistication. President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso entered the room with his characteristic quiet dignity, wearing a simple brown suit that stood in stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. At 34, he was easily the youngest head of state Macron had hosted, and the French president had made no secret of his skepticism about military leaders who came to power through coups rather than elections. President Traore, Macron said with practiced diplomatic warmth, gesturing toward an ornate chair across from him. Welcome to Paris. I trust your first visit to the Élysée has been enlightening. Thank you, President Macron, Traore replied, taking his seat with the same composed manner he displayed in every international setting. The palace is quite impressive. Macron smiled, interpreting the comment as the kind of odd reaction he expected from African leaders visiting the seat of French power. We have much history within these walls. Many important decisions about Africa have been made in this very room. The comment was casual, almost throwaway, but Traore's expression remained carefully neutral as he processed the implications of Macron's phrasing. I'm sure they have, Traore responded diplomatically. As lunch was served by white-gloved staff, Macron launched into what he clearly considered an educational monologue about the complexities of international relations, the importance of experienced leadership, and the dangers of populist rhetoric in developing nations. You see, President Traore, Macron said while cutting his perfectly prepared salmon, governing requires a deep understanding of historical context, economic interdependence, and diplomatic nuance. It's not enough to simply make bold statements about sovereignty and independence. Real leadership means understanding how to work within established systems to achieve gradual progress. Traore listened politely, occasionally nodding, but contributing little to what was essentially a one-sided conversation. Take your decision to expel French military forces from Burkina Faso, Macron continued. I understand the populist appeal of such gestures, but the practical consequences have been quite serious. Terrorist incidents have increased, economic partnerships have been disrupted, and your country has become more isolated from the international community. Has it? Traore asked quietly, speaking for the first time in several minutes. Macron paused, fork halfway to his mouth, clearly not expecting to be questioned. I'm sorry. You said terrorist incidents have increased since we expelled French forces. Has that actually happened? The question was simple but direct, catching Macron off guard. He had been operating under assumptions rather than current intelligence. Well, the situation in the Sahel region generally has been challenging, Macron began. President Macron, Traore interrupted gently, since Burkina Faso took control of our own security operations, terrorist incidents in our territory have decreased by 60%. Our forces, knowing the local terrain and having the trust of local communities, have been significantly more effective than foreign military interventions. The precision of the statistic was clearly unexpected, and Macron shifted uncomfortably. That may be true in the short term, but long-term security requires the kind of sophisticated intelligence networks and advanced equipment that only established military partnerships can provide. Like the sophisticated intelligence that failed to prevent the terrorist attacks that killed hundreds of our citizens while French forces were stationed in our country? Traore asked, his tone remaining respectful but pointed. Macron's diplomatic smile began to fade. This wasn't the deferential conversation he had anticipated. President Traore, I think you may be oversimplifying very complex security challenges, Macron said, his tone becoming more condescending. Military operations in Africa require a level of strategic thinking and resource coordination that, frankly, requires years of experience to understand fully. I see, Traore said simply. And how many years of military experience do you have, President Macron? The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Macron, who had never served in the military, looked genuinely taken aback. That's not the point," Macron stammered. "Military leadership and political leadership require different skill sets. What matters is understanding how to work with international partners who have the resources and expertise to do what, exactly?" Traore interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying a new edge. "To protect African people? Because the evidence suggests that international military interventions in Africa have created more instability than they've resolved." Macron was clearly losing control of the conversation, which had veered far from his intended lecture about the need for African leaders to accept French guidance. "President Traore," Macron said, his voice taking on a sharper tone, "I think you're letting ideological rhetoric cloud your judgment about practical realities. The world is a complicated place, and small countries need experienced partners to navigate international challenges successfully." "Small countries like Burkina Faso?" Traore asked. "Exactly," Macron replied, apparently not recognizing the trap he was walking into. "You're a landlocked nation with limited resources and significant security challenges. You need partners who understand how to work within the international system to achieve your objectives." "And by partners, you mean France?" "France has been a reliable partner to Africa for generations," Macron said, his tone becoming more lecturing. "We've provided security, investment, development assistance, and political guidance through some of the continent's most difficult periods." Traore was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider Macron's words carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured but carried an undertone that made the French president pay closer attention. "President Macron, when you speak about France being a reliable partner to Africa, whose definition of reliability are you using?" "I don't understand the question," Macron replied, though his expression suggested he was beginning to sense danger. "You say France has provided security to Africa. But security for whom? You say France has provided investment, but investment that benefits whom? You say France has provided political guidance, but guidance that serves whose interests?" Each question was delivered with surgical precision, systematically dismantling Macron's narrative about benevolent French involvement in African affairs. "Now you're being deliberately obtuse," Macron said, his diplomatic facade beginning to crack. "French policies in Africa have created stability, promoted development, and prevented conflicts that would have been far worse without our involvement." "Have they?" Traore asked. "President Macron, would you like to discuss some specific examples of French policies in Africa and their actual outcomes for African people?" Macron's expression hardened. "President Traore, I think you're allowing anti-French sentiment to distort your understanding of complex historical relationships." "Anti-French sentiment?" Traore repeated, his eyebrows rising slightly. "President Macron, I'm not anti-French. I'm pro-African. There's a significant difference." The distinction was simple but devastating, highlighting the assumption underlying Macron's entire approach to the conversation. "What I'm questioning is not France as a nation or French people as individuals. What I'm questioning is a system that has consistently prioritized French interests over African development, French corporate profits over African poverty reduction, and French political influence over African sovereignty." Macron was clearly struggling now, his carefully planned diplomatic encounter having turned into something much more challenging than he had anticipated. "President Traore," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that revealed his growing frustration, "you're very young, and I understand that youthful idealism can be appealing. But governance requires maturity, patience, and the wisdom that comes from experience. These romantic notions about complete independence and sovereignty sound appealing, but they're simply not realistic in the modern world." The condescension was unmistakable now, and something shifted in Traore's demeanor. His posture remained relaxed, but his eyes took on a sharper focus. "You're right that I'm young, President Macron," Traore said quietly. "But I'm not naive. And I'm certainly not a boy who needs to be educated about African realities by someone who has never lived them. I didn't say," Macron began. You didn't need to say it explicitly, Traore cut him off, his voice still calm but now carrying unmistakable steel. Your entire approach to this conversation has been based on the assumption that I'm a naive African boy who doesn't understand how the world really works. The phrase, naive African boy, hung in the air between them, and Macron's face flushed as he realized how his attitudes had been perceived. President Traore, I never used those words. You didn't need to use those exact words, Traore replied, his voice gaining strength. Your entire approach to this conversation has been based on that assumption. You've lectured me about complexity as if I've never encountered difficult decisions. You've explained international relations to me as if I've never engaged with world leaders. You've dismissed my policies as populist gestures as if I don't understand their implications. Macron opened his mouth to protest, but Traore wasn't finished. Most tellingly, you've assumed that because I'm young and African and came to power through unconventional means, I must be grateful for your guidance and eager to accept your definition of how the world works. The systematic deconstruction of Macron's assumptions was clearly making the French president uncomfortable, but Traore continued relentlessly. But here's what you don't understand, President Macron. I didn't come to this meeting seeking your approval or your advice. I came here because diplomatic courtesy required it, not because I need a European leader to validate my policies or explain my options to me. President Traore, you're mischaracterizing. Am I? Then let me ask you directly, do you believe that African leaders are capable of making decisions about African affairs without European guidance? The question was simple but profound, cutting to the heart of the neo-colonial mindset that had shaped French policy toward Africa for generations. Macron hesitated, clearly understanding that any answer he gave would be problematic. Of course African leaders are capable, but capacity and experience are different things. Working within established international systems requires knowledge that comes from years of engagement with European leaders who will explain to us how those systems work. Traore interrupted. President Macron, do you hear yourself? You're literally doing exactly what I just described, assuming that African leaders need European tutoring to understand international relations. The trap was perfect, and Macron had walked directly into it. His face was now noticeably flushed, and his diplomatic composure was fraying visibly. This conversation has taken a very unfortunate turn, Macron said, attempting to regain control. I invited you here for a constructive dialogue about how France and Burkina Faso can work together more effectively. And I appreciate that invitation, Traore replied. But your idea of constructive dialogue seems to involve you explaining to me why I should be grateful for French involvement in my country's affairs and why my policies reflect youthful inexperience rather than principled decision-making. That's not what I intended. Perhaps not, Traore acknowledged. But it's certainly what you communicated. And it reveals something important about how France views its relationship with Africa. He leaned forward slightly, his tone becoming more direct. President Macron, you see France as Africa's teacher, guide, and protector. You see French involvement in African affairs as beneficial and necessary. You see African resistance. The tension in the ornate dining room had become palpable. President Macron's carefully orchestrated diplomatic lunch had transformed into something he had never experienced before, a systematic challenge to France's entire relationship with Africa, delivered with surgical precision by someone he had dismissed as inexperienced. President Traore, Macron said, his voice now carrying an edge of real anger, I think you're fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of international cooperation. France doesn't seek to control African nations, we seek to partner with them for mutual benefit. Traore's expression remained calm, but his eyes had taken on a sharper focus. Mutual benefit, President Macron? Let me ask you something specific, in the mutual benefit between France and Africa, who benefits more? The question was simple but devastating, cutting straight to the heart of the relationship's asymmetry. That's an impossible question to quantify, Macron began. Is it? Traore interrupted. Because I can quantify it quite easily. French companies extracted approximately $42 billion worth of resources from Francophone Africa last year. African governments received less than $3 billion in combined taxes, royalties, and wages from those operations. So in this mutual benefit arrangement, France receives $42 billion and Africa receives $3 billion. Would you call that mutual? The precision of the statistics was clearly making Macron uncomfortable, but Traore wasn't finished. Or consider the CFA franc system you mentioned provides stability. The 14 African countries using the CFA franc must deposit 50% of their foreign currency reserves in the French treasury. That's approximately $20 billion in African money sitting in French banks, earning interest for France while African countries pay France for the privilege of using their own currency. Macron's face was flushed now, his diplomatic composure cracking under the weight of facts he couldn't easily dispute. President Traore, you're cherry-picking statistics to support a predetermined narrative. Am I? Traore asked, leaning forward slightly. Then perhaps you could share some statistics that support your narrative about mutual benefit. How much does France invest in African development compared to how much French companies extract from African economies? The challenge was direct and impossible to ignore. Macron shifted in his chair, clearly realizing that this conversation had moved far beyond his control. The relationship between France and Africa is complex and cannot be reduced to simple mathematical equations, Macron said defensively. You're absolutely right, Traore agreed. It's much worse than the mathematical equations suggest. Because the numbers only show the financial exploitation. They don't show the political control, the diplomatic pressure, or the cultural imperialism that accompanies French economic extraction. The phrase, cultural imperialism, seemed to hit Macron particularly hard. Now you're being deliberately inflammatory. Am I? President Macron, how many African languages are taught in French schools? How many African authors are studied in French universities? How many African perspectives on history, philosophy, or governance are considered worthy of French intellectual attention? Each question was like a precision strike, exposing layers of assumptions that Macron had never been forced to examine. Meanwhile, how many African countries are required to teach French as their official language? How many African students must master French literature to succeed in their own educational systems? How many African intellectuals must publish in French to be taken seriously by the international academic community? Traore's voice was gaining strength, his calm demeanor making his words even more powerful. This is cultural imperialism, President Macron. The systematic devaluation of African knowledge, African languages, and African perspectives in favor of European standards that are presented as universal truths. Macron was clearly struggling now, his entire worldview under assault from someone he had expected to treat with condescending courtesy. President Traore, you're engaging in the kind of radical rhetoric that makes constructive international cooperation impossible, Macron snapped, his mask of diplomatic politeness finally slipping completely. Radical rhetoric? Traore repeated, his eyebrows rising. President Macron, what exactly is radical about expecting equal treatment in international relations? What's radical about demanding fair compensation for natural resources? What's radical about wanting to use our own languages in our own schools? The questions expose the absurdity of calling basic dignity and sovereignty radical, highlighting how deeply entrenched colonial attitudes remained in French policy. You want to know what's truly radical? Traore continued, his voice taking on a new intensity. What's radical is a European country controlling the currency of 14 African nations 70 years after the end of colonialism. What's radical is French military bases operating on African soil to protect French corporate interests rather than African security. He stood up slowly, his movement commanding Macron's full attention. What's radical is a French president inviting an African head of state to lunch for the purpose of explaining why that African leader should be grateful for French exploitation and should modify his policies to better serve French interests. The systematic deconstruction was complete, but Traore wasn't finished. But you want to know what I find most remarkable about this conversation, President Macron? You genuinely believe that your approach is reasonable, beneficial, and necessary. You cannot even conceive of a world where African countries control their own resources, make their own decisions, and pursue their own interests without seeking French approval. Macron opened his mouth to respond, but Traore continued speaking. You called me naive, and you're absolutely right. I was naive enough to think that a French president in 2024 might be capable of engaging with an African leader as an equal rather than as a subordinate requiring guidance. The personal nature of the attack was clearly painful for Macron, who prided himself on his progressive international image. I was naive enough to believe that France might have evolved beyond the colonial mentality that sees Africa as a collection of client states rather than sovereign nations. That's enough. Macron snapped, his diplomatic facade completely abandoned. President Traore, you're being deliberately insulting and ignoring the positive contributions that France has made to African development over generations. Positive contributions? Traore asked, his voice now carrying a note of genuine incredulity. President Macron, would you like me to list France's positive contributions to African development? He began counting on his fingers, his tone becoming sardonic. The slave trade that depopulated entire regions of Africa for centuries. The colonial conquest that destroyed indigenous political systems and imposed extractive economies designed to serve European rather than African interests. The arbitrary borders that grouped hostile ethnic groups together and divided cohesive communities across national boundaries. Macron's face was now flushed with anger, but Traore continued relentlessly. The post-independence interventions that assassinated leaders who threatened French economic interests and supported dictators who protected French corporate investments. The structural adjustment programs that forced African countries to privatize public services and eliminate trade barriers that protected local industries. Each item on the list was delivered with clinical precision, creating a devastating historical indictment of French policy in Africa. The CFA Franc system that prevents monetary independence. The military bases that ensure political compliance. The cultural policies that systematically devalue African languages, knowledge systems, and intellectual traditions. Traore paused, allowing the weight of this historical record to sink in. These are France's contributions to African development, President Macron. And when African leaders like me reject these contributions and assert our right to control our own affairs, you call us naive, radical, and ungrateful. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Macron sat rigid in his chair, clearly struggling to formulate a response to such a comprehensive attack on French policy. President Traore, he finally said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, I think this meeting has run its course. Your anti-French hostility makes productive dialogue impossible. Traore smiled slightly, the first time his expression had changed during the entire confrontation. There it is, he said quietly. When faced with facts about French policy in Africa, you retreat to accusations of anti-French hostility. When challenged about the asymmetrical nature of Franco-African relations, you claim that criticism makes dialogue impossible. He moved toward the door, his posture relaxed despite the intensity of the conversation. President Macron, I'm not anti-French. I'm pro-African. And until France can understand the difference, productive dialogue will indeed be impossible. As Traore reached the door, he turned back to face the French president one final time. You called me a naive African boy who doesn't understand how the world works. But I understand exactly how the world works. The question is whether you're ready to accept that the world is changing, and that Africa is no longer willing to accept the role you've assigned to us. As the door closed behind him, Macron sat alone in the ornate dining room, surrounded by the symbols of French power that had failed to impress or intimidate the young African leader who had just systematically dismantled 70 years of French policy in Africa. The naive African boy had just given the President of France an education that would haunt the Élysée Palace for years to come.